Well, good afternoon. I see we have lots of young faces. Thank you, Neil. It was nice for you to bring your class here. But anyway, I'm going to talk about some of the genomic tools that our group at the University of Alberta has been working on, as well as with Delta Genomics. And I know that Michelle is here from, there she is at the back, from Delta Genomics. She's the CEO there. So you should get to know her really well, because maybe when the business takes off, there's somebody there that will have some jobs for you. So Michelle has been very important right along the line in terms of developing these genomic tools. One of the things that I want to say is that to develop new things, particularly in the area of genetics or genomics, requires a lot of data, requires sequence data, like your whole genome being sequenced. It requires a lot of genotypes. And then, of course, it requires a lot of characterizing the animals for everywhere from growth rate, calving difficulty, feed efficiency. And we use those things to inform or do data analytics on all of the genotypes we have. And so you develop prediction equations that tells a lot of things, everywhere from what your ancestry was to whether you're good in terms of growth rate, etc. So what I wanted to do is just show you that not everybody can do this kind of work. It requires a lot of investment and a long time. I think, years and years ago, we started doing feed efficiency phenotyping right here at Olds College in 2003. And so some of the very first, what we call feed efficiency or RFI testing, was done right here at Olds College. And I think the first year we did this, Neil, we had maybe 50 animals. I can't remember what it was, but it wasn't very many. And I'm hearing right now that 300 bulls are being tested this year at Olds College in that same facility. And because of the tech center, this is expanding. So you can see that the technology and the requirement for skilled labor is increasing dramatically, even to the point where there are people in Calgary saying that data analytics in agriculture is kind of going to be like the old technology surrounding oil and gas industry. In any event, we also have major collaborations in terms of similar groups in the United States with USDA, in Australia with the 1,000 Bull Project. Those are 1,000 bull genomes, and each genome is really expensive. The human genome, I think, took about 20, 30 years to fully sequence, and about $3 billion, right? So we're not going to spend $3 billion on cattle. But right now, you can essentially do a cattle genome in a couple months, unless Michelle tells me I'm wrong, for maybe $10,000. Am I close, Michelle? 3,000, it's come down. What a deal. I must be paying too much. Anyway, so the technology has moved very dramatically. And of course, we also have very strong collaboration with Ireland, which has a strong genetic program, genomics program. Under the domain name of My Herd and Me, which is kind of a catchy little name that we put our genomic tools under, we have about 4 tools that we can use, or 3 main ones, and they're all under the trade name Vigor HX, and that's a service that is trademarked by Delta Genomics, and they offer a service. And I'm going to go through those various tools and just build the scientific basis behind them. I'm not hired by the company, by Delta Genomics. I'm a scientist, and we look for the evidence, the science-based evidence, and that I'm going to share with you today in a friendly fashion. I'm not going to get into too many complicated things. But primarily the tools are under the name, which is parentage or sire identification. We call it Who's Your Daddy, just because it makes some people laugh and offends others. But in any event, that's kind of a neat way. And it's essentially because we're using SNP technology there and the price is coming down. And a lot of those new developments in that area have come about because of, the work that Delta's done and Livestock Gentech have done in collaboration with others. I only do a little bit there just to show you the value of parentage. The real area that I'll spend some time on is what we call Ancestry.com for cattle. It is essentially working out the breed composition of cattle. And I'm going to show you why that's important. You're going to say, who cares, right? I can tell. I can just look at an animal. I mean, my dad used to tell me that. I grew up in the cattle industry. And of course, my dad could tell what the breed composition was of every animal. And he was 100% wrong most of the time. So, and now I'm probably that way. But anyway, we use breed composition, genomic breed composition, for things like mate matching and for genomically determined heterozygosity. And you'll find out the importance of that. And it really relates to hybrid vigor. The other thing we'll be talking about is EPDs, so expected progeny differences. Those are the genetic merit that you would see on bulls or females that you use for breeding. But in our case, we're talking about the molecular part of that. We're going to do molecular breeding values, which is just based on the DNA. In other words, we use the DNA to predict that animal is going to be feed efficient or grow fast, rather than the pedigree. And in commercial industry, that has a lot of value. And then the last thing that I would likely not spend any time on is the use of genomic technology in branding programs, to certify branding programs. And if you use your imagination a little bit as we go through this journey over the next half hour or so, you'll see that there's lots of applications to genomic breed composition and other things we can do in this area. And it's only your imagination that's probably going to stop us from a new application. So let's talk about the business of sire identification and why it's important. Well, a lot of us have said that 80% of genetic improvement comes through the sire. You might find that to be strange because, it should be 50-50, sire and dam, but the sire has such an important part to play in the herd. It can produce anywhere from, 20 to 40 progeny or more, and so it has a large impact on the genetic improvement of your herd. A sire or a young bull takes around $1,800 to produce, so it better be doing something for you. And I will show you this. This comes from one of our clients. This is Cow-Calf Health Management Services, in which we looked at the number of progeny that about 118 sires provided. And you can see that some of those sires produced very few progeny, and some of them produced over 40. So if you're doing a replacement heifer selection, you would sure want to be picking from something that was fertile. In other words, a sire that's had lots of progeny indicates to me, with no statistics or no long formula, that it's probably going to produce fertile daughters and daughters that are worthwhile. So that's one of the basic things. But other things that are important are in terms of generating carcass value, because remember, those sires are being used to not only produce replacement heifers, but to produce feeder cattle. And there are large differences in carcass value among sires. Here is just a little example. There's 3 breeding programs we have here. Don't worry about what they are. They're just different breeding programs that we're using in this case. And there's 29 sires in one breeding program, and 48 in another, and 15 in another. And you can see, I worked with Dr. Mike McNeil. He's a quantitative geneticist from Montana State, and others, and essentially created genetic merit values for carcass value. And you can see right there's this huge range everywhere from, in one case, minus 186 to minus $19 per animal slaughtered, which is about $200 a head, or whatever it is, $170 a head. And don't worry about the negative. It just happened to be when we were calculating the value in that part of the industry. The industry was going through a negative period in which feeder cattle were being purchased for a very high price, and slaughter values dropped dramatically. But it's really the difference you want to look at. So there's a lot of value there, about $150 difference in carcass value of the progeny. So each progeny is bringing one bull's progeny is bringing $150 more than the worst on that list. So it's something that is that I think everybody needs to pay attention to. And the cost of genotyping for parentage is not that high. $20, let's say, or $12 to $20. But I think there's much more than parentage that we can get out of this. The next thing is this business around Ancestry.com or genomic breed composition, and using it to do mate matching and retained heterozygosity. And I have to talk a little bit about the beef industry in North America. The beef industry in North America is about crossbreeding, right? 95% of the cattle that go for slaughter that exist in the industry are crossbred, and we use purebreds to be sires and build breeding stock or seed stock to go into the crossbreeding. So when you look at it, probably 85% of purebred bulls or seed stock bulls are sold to crossbreeders. Okay, not to purebred breeders, but to people that are in the commercial industry. And so what you want to do is as a purebred breeder, you want to make sure that your bulls are working primarily for the commercial beef industry, not for the show industry. When you do your first cross between two divergent breeds, let's say Hereford and Angus, those are quite different breeds. The first cross is called the F1. And something called retained heterozygosity, which is related to hybrid vigor, is 100% in the F1 cross. If we're dealing with a rotational crossbreeding program where we're doing two purebred parents. And so then what we do is when the next generation comes along, we refer to the second generation in terms of the amount of hybrid vigor that animal has as retained heterozygosity, or the retained hybrid vigor in that animal. The reason we use crossbreeding, of course, is for hybrid vigor. We get a boost in performance, particularly fertility traits. So think about that. What's the most important trait for commercial cow-calf production? Fertility, right? Calf on the ground. that's number one. And then comes maybe growth traits, and then comes carcass traits. And they're in the magnitude of what I call 10 to 2 to 1. So fertility traits are 10 times more important than carcass traits, and 5 times more important than growth traits. So just think in your own herds or in what you know, where we spend the most time in terms of genetic selection. It seems to be out of whack with what's really important to commercial cow-calf producers. One of the other things that we've been noticed, so primarily hybrid vigor is why we use crossbreeding. We also use it in this thing called breed complementarity. We use the strengths of one breed to complement the weaknesses of another, right? And that's one of the beauties about crossbreeding, is that you can actually sort of fill in the holes in your crossbred progeny of some of the weaknesses in some of your breeds. Now, over the last 30 years or so, we would have thought, or we have seen this steady decline in the amount of crossbreeding that's going on. Years and years ago, I used to drive down the countryside, and I would see every color along the road in herds. So there'd be white, and there'd be black, and there'd be gray, and it was just a mix match. And over the 30 years, we've essentially gone to a red and black herd. And that's primarily because of Angus influence. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of them could be herds have gotten bigger. There's been a consolidation, and therefore producers, large producers, can't take on too much risk. In other words, if I bring in a breed that I'm not confident about and it increases calving difficulty, that's bad news. I can't take that risk. So I have to have assurance of predictability. One of the breeds that have done that very, very well is the Angus Association, because they have a lot of registries in North America, and so they have much more accurate breeding values. There's just more data going in. They still have some room for improvement there with commercial progeny, but there's been a lot of data go into their database. The other reason is that Angus cows tend to be what we call early maturing. That means early fattening. Early maturing and early fattening are things that sort of go together. And so when you do that, fattening is associated with fertility. And so that's one of the other reasons. And because they have this early maturing capability, that means when it comes down to carcass traits, they have the marbling that may go with that some. Not as good as some breeds, but pretty darn good. Now, if you are down that path and your herd is primarily Angus or Black Angus or Red Angus, you've kind of given up something, and that's a hybrid vigor. And if you don't have much hybrid vigor in a herd and you're in a more extensive range condition, in other words, you're trying to get your cattle to fend for themselves, graze all winter. I know at Lacombe, we graze from November to February through deep snow, cold, and we have to have a very specific cow type out there to be able to handle that. And it happens to be one that you need a little bit more hybrid vigor in. And I'll show you evidence to do that. Now, what some of you might say is, well, I don't need genomics to tell me the breed composition of an offspring. I can just do that by pedigree. Well, there's two issues with that. One, the vast majority of commercial producers do not keep pedigree, let alone records. Okay, so that's a big thing, and they think that it can be done mostly by eye, and so I'll show you in a bit why it's kind of difficulty. The other thing that kind of messes that up a little bit is a genetic phenomenon called recombination or genetic crossover. DNA is actually inherited in chunks. Every generation, and what I have up on the screen there is just a depiction of a chromosome for one chromosome for an Angus sire and one for a Hereford dam, and that's going to be my cross. Every generation, every chromosome has 2 or 3 crossovers. It's kind of like Mendelian sampling or the mixing of the genetic material so that the animal has more variability, and it's actually an evolutionary check so that an animal doesn't become, animals don't become a genetic bottleneck. So here we go, we've got this cross, and I'll show you what's going to happen in terms of the breed composition here. So our expectation is that the offspring would be 50-50. That's no big strange thing for anybody, but just where those boxes change to the different pair, chromosomal pair, is where a crossover is going to occur. So you can see on the sire, 1 crossover occurs, and on the dam, a couple crossovers occur. And so what I'm going to do is proceed this little animation and show you that, sure enough, even though the DNA got there in a different way, we end up with an F1 progeny that is essentially 50-50 Hereford Angus. So that makes sense. So that's our F1 cross. Now guess what happens when we do exactly the same thing with a different cross. Here we're going to take our F1 female, 50-50, and we're going to cross it with a Simmental sire. And we're going to see what happens. I'm going to have the crossovers occur exactly in the same place. They don't, by the way, but I'm going to have them just for the simplicity of this example. Our expectation is that the progeny are going to be 50% Simmental and then 25-25, right, for Hereford Angus. That's what we expect them. But in actual fact, this is what will happen or could happen. And for sure, this has been easily proven in all of the crosses that we see and that we genotype. So you can see that The cross actually ends up as a 50% Simmental and a 15% Angus and a 40% Hereford. Even in full sibs, the genomic breed composition will vary by 6 to 10%. So full sibs should be pretty darn much the same, but they're not. And think about brothers and sisters, right? There's a lot of genetic variability that goes on there as well. The other thing that could really throw a loop into this is, what if the Simmental bull that you think is mostly Simmental is not? Because remember, there's this thing about grading up to purebreds. As soon as it becomes 15/16ths, it's considered to be, purebred. So if we have that assumption, and the Simmental bull is actually 20% Angus or 25% Angus, this again throws a loop into what you suspect your cow herd is. And so very quickly, commercial cattle producers will lose track of what their herd is. And I'll show some examples of this so that it's a little bit clear. So the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to show you that genomic breed composition is accurate. Okay, that's the very first thing you got to do. And it tends to be more accurate than pedigree. And here's an example that's published and accepted by reputable journals. And here we look at the relationship between genomic breed composition and breed composition by pedigree. And the accuracy is around 96%. So that R square you see over there on the side, that's 96% accurate. It will never be 100% accurate because of recombination. And if you see that little red star at the bottom there, if you can, do I have a pointer? Yeah, right there. That's a pedigree error. We were told that was a certain breed of sire, and it wasn't, and genomic breed composition picked that up pretty good. So we can use that. So we know it's accurate. It's probably the gold standard. It is the gold standard for breed composition in cattle. So what we can do with that is, if we do a genotype, we essentially can do it on, let's say, a heifer progeny. There's an example of this particular heifer progeny that's 17%, 18% Simmental, and about 80% Angus. And in this case, we also did a genomic breed composition on the sire, and of course, it's just purebred Angus mostly. And then by back calculation for nothing, just by calculating back, any one of you can do this. It's not hard. It's not quantum physics or anything like that. It's just straight calculation. You can back calculate the dam for nothing. So that's the dam. Now, in this particular cross, if you knew what the dam was, knowing what we know now, that the dam is primarily, 60% Angus and 35% Simmental, is that the bull we would have chose? And that's the real question that you've got to do. And this is about mate matching. And really what you're trying to do with mate matching is you're trying to maintain breeding goals that you have, what you're going for. Whether it's for calving ease in your replacement heifer or something else in your main cow herd. And then you're trying to increase or maintain a certain amount of hybrid vigor in your females and in your progeny, but it really comes into important within your females. And I'll show you that later. It has a huge impact. So here's an example, maybe something that's more realistic. And so, what do you think the breed composition of this good-looking replacement heifer is? I've been told it's good-looking, so I'm repeating that. But in any event, this is one of the replacement heifers that we have at the Lacombe Research Station. It's one of the ones we're going to keep, I'm told. And if I look at that, I say that that's primarily Red Angus. But if you look at that, what would you say? And would you say that had a lot of hybrid vigor in it? Any thoughts? What do you think? I'm not trying to fool you or anything. Wink, wink. Right? So to me, it looks like Red Angus, right? And I don't have to go very far. I mean, if you looked at it hard, you can actually see a little bit of white on that animal, so it's likely not purebred or full blood. But in any event, here's the genomic breed composition on that animal. It's 53% Angus, red Angus, and it's about 40% Simmental. So that totally changes what I'm going to do in terms of breeding. Totally. If I thought that was all Angus, I would have just said, I'm going to pick a Simmental. I'm as an example, right? I'm not in favor of any one breed over another, but in this case, that's what I do. You notice its hybrid vigor score, which is related to heterozygosity, it's 55, 56%, pretty good. You know, I mean, if we think of, 0 is pretty much like a purebred, and 100% or 1 is like an 8-way composite. Right? That's really hard to do, by the way, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't maintained large composite populations, is to maximize heterozygosity or hybrid vigor is a very hard thing to do, and it's hard to keep track of breeding pastures, and it takes a lot of labor and so on and so forth. But this particular heifer having 55, 60% hybrid vigor score, that's pretty good, and that's one of the things that Delta would give you in terms of one of the services they provide. Here's another little example for you. Here, this animal looks, it's from the same herd. It looks more variable. It's got, white face, and I had expected to have more hybrid vigor. And so I might say, well, this one here probably has a fair amount of Simmental in it, little less Angus, but in actual fact, it kind of fools you just by color and type. It's got a lot of red Angus in it. And the color pattern, remember, color is under the control of 10, 15 genes, if that, and so therefore it doesn't give you a true reflection of what might be going on with that animal. And its hybrid vigor score is what I would consider on the low side, and to me it wouldn't be a major candidate for keeping. And so that's one of the things I would like to do, and I'll show you why that hybrid vigor score is so important, everything else being equal. Remember, we've got to develop those replacement heifers properly. They've got to reach a certain target weight by the breeding season. They've got to be properly nourished. They've got to have a vaccination program. But once we get all that, you'll find out very quickly why we talk about retained heterozygosity. Now, one of the things we've got to say is there an opportunity in the industry? In Alberta, does this even matter? Because we crossbreed. So therefore, everybody has high hybrid vigor in their herd. But actually the opposite is true. This is a herd, very good one, good commercial cattle producer, part of the Cow-Calf Health Management Services client list. By the way, that service provider provides veterinary genomic advice to people who own, ranchers who own over 100,000 cows. So this is not insignificant. And look at how much distribution there is in terms of hybrid vigor. There's everywhere from 10% to 75%. I'm pretty sure that this is something that's going on in this herd that the ranch manager is not aware of. And so really what you would like to do is see that skewed, that distribution for both cows and progeny pushed way over to one side, more like the 65, 75% level, because that's going to improve cow fertility and survivability of the offspring. And when we do it on larger numbers, we see this kind of thing going on. This is 2,300 progeny in their dams, and you can see it is skewed in one direction, but there's still a lot of cows and progeny that could benefit from an infusion of a little bit different genetics to improve their hybrid vigor score. So why is this important? Well, one of the very first things is we looked at the relationship between this hybrid vigor score and feed efficiency, residual feed intake. And I'm sure some of you have learned about residual feed intake, or our new feed efficiency trait. And these are in feeder cattle and heifers. And essentially, we looked at it in 3 different groups of cattle. They're small groups, mind you. And you see that the linear effect in terms of dry matter intake per day per 1% increase in hybrid vigor is negative. That's the very first thing you see. So really what that means is that the more hybrid vigor you have, the better your feed efficiency. Because as we know, residual feed intake is expressed on a negative scale. Kind of confusing, but that's what it is. So this just means those animals are more efficient. But you know something? It is not really impressing me to any great extent, because if you look at the amount of dry matter, that means, you know, 0.08 kilograms a day for each 10% increase. So that's not a lot over a long feeding program. And if I jumped from, you know, 30 to 60% hybrid vigor, you know, it might mean $18 a head. So it's not a lot, but it is in the right direction. And so that's pretty interesting in itself. One of the things you'll have to learn, that you will notice, is that hybrid vigor really is important in traits that do not have a lot, that are not heritable, that are lowly heritable. So that's where it has its biggest impact. And so those are fertility traits that are going to be most infected. And so things like weaning weight and yearling weight and birth weight, etc., will only have about 3-4% hybrid vigor. So as I said, really, historically, we know with all the crossbreeding studies, there's really been two huge ones. Anybody that is going to get involved in crossbreeding or breeding work needs to look at these. One was conducted in Canada, which was called the Brandon-Manyberry study, and it essentially was evaluating foreign breeds, crossing of foreign breeds, so Charolais, Simmental, Limousin, anything that came from Europe, and that's why we called them continental breeds. That were coming over here in the 70s, late 70s. And so then what we did is all sorts of crosses against the traditional breeds that were here. Hereford and Angus and Shorthorn were the main crosses. So he did all sorts of crosses, two-way rotational crosses, three-way composites of all sorts. You know, you got even up there an eight-way composite. And you'll see that as you increase the amount of heterozygosity in those crossbred populations, that the weaned calf, the pounds of weaned calf per cow exposed to breeding increased. Now, this is not because calf weaning weight got bigger. That's not why it is. It's because more cows calved. That's what it means. It's fertility. And so that became a very interesting thing. And here's just a little thing to show you the relationship. And it's quite important. And I will reinforce that in a little bit just with this so that you can actually see what goes on. So what we wanted to do is look at the relationship between this hybrid vigor score that was genomically determined and fertility. And so we had a captive population at the research station. So here we looked at 412 replacement heifers. So this is replacement heifers that we brought into our herd and then followed them. What happened to them? And we followed them for 5 years. The reason we didn't follow them for a lot longer is when you start getting to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's not many left, right? So as a group of 400 or 500, by the time you get to 10 years old, there's not too many that have made it there. If they have in a herd, then I would say you've got a very good maternal base in your herd. So we followed those over 5 calvings, consecutive calvings, over 10, almost well over 1,000 matings, and just looked at some traits. Well, here you go. Here's some of the. So the most important thing is the linear effect, right? If you've got this continuous trait that you called hybrid vigor score, it means the more hybrid vigor you get, the higher something should go or the lower something should go. And that's kind of the relationship you want to look for. We have a 200-day weaning weight, and you see that every 10% change that we get in the hybrid vigor score, we gain 3 pounds. Remember what I said before? Traits like growth rate and weaning weight aren't really that much affected by hybrid vigor. They are affected, but not in a really large way. So 3 pounds is not a lot, but it's still in the right direction. Age at first calving, here we see that it's -2 days for each 10% change. So minus means that the heifer was younger at first calving. That's a good thing, right? Right? Those of you who have cattle, having an animal that's younger, not too young, but that's younger at calving means that she's going to rebreed sooner. Actually, your calf is going to be heavier too, right, at weaning, because you're weaning at a set date, so the calf is going to be older. So there's some positive things to that. But here's where the real change starts to occur. Things like pregnancy rate. So there's a 2 percentile point per 10% change. So that's really significant. 2% means 2 calves. 2 out of a herd of 100. If you've got 100 replacement hares, that means 2 more. That's pretty important if a calf, when I wean it, is worth $1,500 or whatever it is these days. That's pretty telling. And if I'm going from 30% retained heterozygosity in my herd to 60%, that should mean a 6% change, or 6 calves per 100. So those are very significant numbers. Lifetime productivity, 79 pounds. So just think about, the price of weaned calves right now is $2 a pound. So it's like $160. So not insignificant. And then, of course, days in the herd. And, of course, this has to do with replacement days. So it means 51 more days in the herd for every 10% change. So what I'm going to do now is, that's the linear effect, but I thought in terms of putting it into a little bit more understandable thing, I'm just going to divide my herd. I'm going to divide my herd into what I call a low hybrid vigor herd and a high hybrid vigor herd. And I'm going to see what this means to net income over, 4 or 5 calvings. So the very first thing I see here is survival. And I have defined survival this way. And this is survival of a cow. So she has a calving record. It means she survived. If she didn't, she didn't. She's gone, right? And she's gone for a couple reasons. Open in the fall. Okay, this time of year, preg check, preg evaluation, she's open, we sell her. We at least cull her from the breeding herd and then say, okay, well, maybe we'll fatten her up or do something with it, but she's gone. And then the other reason is that maybe she died, or maybe there is an abortion, and that would be another reason. But in any event, she calved. Then survival to the second parity or second calf means that I didn't cull her at weaning time. Remember, because you could cull that young female because she chased you around the yard, poor performance, or poor temperament, poor performance, bad structure, etc., whatever your choices are. So essentially, that's what it means. And you notice our high hybrid vigor herd, or high retained heterozygosity herd, has a lower culling rate. In other words, heifers are surviving longer in this particular herd. So it says that 47% of high GH hybrid vigor herds survive to the third parity, right? So that means more calves, less culling costs. And so you can see there's a difference, and it's starting to accumulate. And if I do this over 5 parities, this is what happens to net income. Same herd, same thing. One herd made me $80,000 more than the other herd, just because they had a higher hybrid vigor score. That is a lot of money, and I just wouldn't understand why you wouldn't take advantage of it. Essentially works out to $161 per animal, per female, per year, right? So it's significant. So if I spent something like $20 or $40 on something to tell me that, I would find that there was return on investment. But that needs to be determined in each case, and I think that's something that a person, a ranch manager, would have to sit down and work out and see what goes on. Well, there's another advantage to it too, and it has to do with this breathing dragon here, right? The one that's breathing out all this methane. And in the breath, of course, there's methane and CO2, and we actually measure the breath to measure methane coming from animals. And at the bottom of that, you see the most recent attack on the production of beef cattle. And this is a Richard Branson's dinner, which essentially has no animal-based protein in it at all. It's really all plant-based protein, and is essentially recommending that we move almost exclusively to a plant-based protein. And of course, it's just another one of those things that gives a bad rap to the production of livestock, right? And I'm going to sort of try to put that perspective for you, so that you can decide for yourself. We know that ruminants produce methane, and they produce quite a bit of methane, and that methane is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. It's 25 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2. So it comes out of a tailpipe. But here's some of the things that we should also know, is that in terms of global livestock production, that only accounts for 14.5% of global man-made. So right now, we know that if we get rid of all livestock, it's 14.5% of the problem. Okay? So that's the very first thing that you should get into your mind. Beef production is 6% of that, so 6% of global man-made. So even less, right? So let's get rid of all the beef cattle, and that's what it's going to be. And if we talk about in Canada, beef production is 0.07% of global man-made. So we're really small time, right, on the global stage when it comes down to the amount of greenhouse gases that's coming from beef production. And there it is in terms of Canada. Now, what is important to realize is that ruminants graze on grasslands that sequester carbon. Now, we could argue that not a lot of carbon gets sequestered in a well-managed pasture situation or grazing situation because it's at equilibrium. The ruminant is grazing, the forage is giving off methane and CO2, and sunlight through photosynthesis, we're gaining carbon. And so we could argue that the system is at equilibrium. But let's think about this. If we start converting that rangeland into cropland, or into parks, or into parking lots, we lose from 20 to 60% of the stored carbon. That is a lot, and that goes into the atmosphere, and it stays there for a long period of time. And so having ruminants and having grazing livestock on the land helps us maintain the carbon that's there and helps us produce food from a different high-quality food and is sustaining rural communities. So simple solutions are not the answer, like let's just go to a protein base. So after all that I've said to you, let's go back to our example where we're talking about our high hybrid vigor herd and our low, and just look at the carbon footprint of those things and see if there's anything that's really, really good there. Well, we did a life cycle assessment on those two. That means that we look at the greenhouse gas from fermentation, so that's from digestion of feed by the ruminant, from manure, N2O, methane, cropping N2O, energy, and so on and so forth. And this follows a classical way in which we do life cycle analysis. This type of analysis is peer reviewed, so I'm just summarizing it for you. And you'll see that the carbon footprint for our high vigor herd is lower than our low vigor herd. And that amounts to a savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of around 639 kilograms of CO2e per animal slaughtered. So that's pretty significant. Within Alberta, we could actually gain carbon credits regardless of which government is in power, regardless of whichever government is in power. We could actually gain carbon credits because Alberta has had a carbon offset program since 2007. Unfortunately, we do not have at this present time a cow-calf protocol. And that if we had that, we could take advantage of this and other technologies. That is a significant amount of carbon that could be not emitted into the atmosphere. And so if you look at it, $19 a head over many years and over many cattle amounts to a lot of money. Remember, this would be for just keeping records and doing the technology. So to me, that's a very significant opportunity for cattle producers. Okay, so let's just change a little bit here and talk about EPDs for a minute. These are expected progeny differences. We use genomics to get them more accurate. What they do is they tell you what a sire or a dam is going to do in terms of their progeny. So if there's a EPD on a sire of -1 for birth weight, it means that its progeny should be 1 pound lower relative to the breed average. So that sounds pretty good. And if you do it through pedigree and keep lots of records, that you get some pretty accurate values, predictive values. Unfortunately, in a commercial operation, some of that falls down because we're taking purebred sires from whatever breed and they're purebred EPDs and trying to apply them within a commercial setting. So you can imagine I've got an Angus sire with really good accuracy on a birth weight that I like, and I bring it into a crossbreeding situation where I'm breeding it to something different, a short-horn Maine Anjou cross, no such thing. But in any way, you can see how quickly that might break down and get confusing. And so what we're trying to do with genomics is use DNA to help that accuracy. In other words, make it more applicable across breeds. And just one of the things that I'll show you there, we are making some headway here. Here's marbling, and this is commercial cattle marbling. So these are molecular breeding values that just come from a DNA test, and they're predicted for a bunch of sires, in this case 79 sires. So we have the molecular breeding value on the sire, and then we take all of their progeny, and they're all crossbred progeny, lots of different types, and we put them into Cargill, and we get their marbling scores. And you'll see that even, it's not perfect in terms of the relationship, but it's pretty darn good. And so what it's showing is that pretty soon our molecular breeding values for use in the commercial beef industry are going to be very good. And so one of the things that you'll have to realize when it comes down to EPDs, whether they're molecular or just in the traditional sense, is that to properly apply them, they need to be applied in a multi-trait selection index. So that's what I mean by a breeding goal that you need to have. So that's just a little bit there. I don't want to go too deep there because we are sort of getting on in time. But I do want to show you that many of the accuracies are improving. Here we've got a bunch of carcass traits, marbling, back fat, ribeye area, lean meat yield, and you see that our genetics people, they give us the mean accuracy. And while that accuracy is the calculated accuracy, more important is the actual accuracy that we get when we do a cross-validation and we take it into the field. And you can see that in this case, the correlations are very good between the EPDs, or the molecular breeding value, and the traits. They're all in the 0.4, 0.48 kind of a range, which is pretty darn good. And it just means that they're improving and they have predictive ability. Okay. So I want to end there, and I want to just sort of summarize things and put things in perspective. There's a couple genomic tools there that I've shown that have value, maybe $200 value. But in each case, in each producer's case, they have to look at what their goals are for their herd and how this technology can be used. Some of the technology comes in at $45 a test, which is a barrier, which can be a barrier to adoption. But I think that if one strategically samples their herd, in other words, not everything, and not everything at first. So for sure the sires, and there might be 4 sires or 10 sires a year, so that's not too big of a bill. And then just the replacement heifers that you're bringing in. So it brings down the total cost, your total investment. And so then what'll happen is immediately you will get your dams for those progeny for free. So you'll know a third of your herd right away, your cow herd, in terms of genomic breed composition, and you can tell which direction you're going in. And guess what? After a few years, you might have all of your cows with genomic breed composition, and picking replacement heifers that have a lot of hybrid vigor in them, as well as other traits. Never lose sight of the other traits. And so we can use this in terms of better mate matching and culling decisions, more accurate genetic selection. And I haven't talked anything about branding, but you can use this in terms of certification of a branding. So just think about certified Angus or Angus Pride, etc., right? Is that you could actually say the cattle that are going into a feedlot are 50, 60% or more of the Angus breed. So it does fit pretty good in that sense. So how much time do I have left? Any? Who's?
As much as you like, John.
Okay, so I'm not sure that's what all the audience wants to hear. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to. Whoops, that's forward, wrong way. And we're going to talk about a breeding goal for that animal. Say you've got a herd like that. It's red, right? And you've been using red Angus, and you might also have some black ones in there as well. And you're thinking about, I've got this herd, and now let's talk about a breeding goal. And you can, and I want participation here because I'm not going to tell you. So just give me an example of a breeding goal for maternal traits, making yourself money within the female side of the operation. So let's just have at her. Make
sure she produces a cow.
Yeah. So how are you going to do that? So what things would you look at to make sure she had a calf right now, without knowing anything? Right. We have no genomic tools, and we're just looking at this animal. And this would be very common. We'd go, what's good about that animal that I like, that thinks she's going to give me a calf every year for the next 5 or 6 years?
Well, I look at my records.
Right? You'd be one of the few, and good for you. I like that.
Yeah.
So you look at your records how?
Well, to see what her mother has done.
Yeah, very nice. Right? So the breeding goal in this case, we didn't state it, but I could hear it. The breeding goal was to pick a replacement heifer that had a calf every year, and I would think the calf would have to be a pretty good calf, right? A big calf. So you might say produce a heavy calf, 550 weight calf at weaning every year. That's your breeding objective in this particular case. So there's an example that we just walked through this and did some, just thought about this a little bit, and we came up with the breeding goal because it's really what's important to you. What makes you money? And I notice what you didn't say is an animal that gives me good marbling.
No.
Right? So you stuck with the thing that really made you money, which was a calf on the ground, right? Really, really good. So you would think, with what you said with your records, go back to mom, and she's had a calf. So after a few generations of doing this, 30 years of doing this, in my case, you'd think we'd have it solved, right? But we don't. And I'm going to give you an example why we don't. Back in the 80s, I was involved in a large cow-calf audit, and we surveyed 6,000 cow-calf herds in Alberta. And the average calf crop percentage at that time was 84%. I remember that. And calf crop percentage means calves wean from cows exposed to breeding. Okay? That's what it means, because that's really the economically important thing. So 10 years later, with 1,700 herds, we did exactly the same thing, and calf crop percentage was 85%. Ooh, it seems to be going up, so some progress seems to be being made. And then very recently, I took a look at benchmark herds that are being kept in Alberta, in Alberta by Alberta Agriculture, and looked at the calf crop percentage for, 2012, 13, 14, 15. And the calf crop percentage were 83, 84, 85, 83%. Exactly the same. So over 30 years, nutrition technology has improved. Damn well know it. Vaccination, health, grazing management, all has improved. But we haven't done a damn thing about our calf crop percentage. Nothing's changed. And it really has to do with open rate. Death loss, if you look at it, it's also been constant, but it's very low. It's about 4%. So most of the calves that we're losing, those 16 calves we're losing out of 100, are from open rate. We're not making any improvement, even though we're picking from mama cows that have lasted a long time in the herd. Recombination kind of comes to play here. Mama cows in the herd, and we have short breeding seasons for our young cows, right? Yesterday we were talking with Darren Bevins from Deseret Ranches. They have their breeding season for replacement heifers at 30 days. Man, that's one cycle, right, in a bit. That's very, 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 very strong pressure. But again, they're about in the same boat, right? So what the heck is going on here? So that's one thing. But that's a very good breeding goal. And I would say here, if we looked at this animal, so this is a real animal that we have in our herd, and we know that animals that have this kind of hybrid vigor are the ones that have a high probability of rebreeding. So I think all the things you said, plus hybrid vigor score, would be useful. Now you can determine that if you kept good records and you know by pedigree. You can do this by pedigree, but just kind of on average. It's not as accurate, but at least you'd be in the ballpark. But if you don't keep lots of records and lots of pedigree, you're blind, right? You're going to be looking at this thing. I like this from a structural point of view. It's got lots of depth in its frame and all the words that we want to use, right? So, and our cattle people at the research station are very good too. And yet I'm talking and seeing these differences about the herd that we have at Lacombe. And we're missing something is what I'm saying. We're missing a very important trait, and I think it has a lot to do with hybrid vigor, the amount of hybrid vigor the females have. So hybrid vigor, we've always known it has to do with fitness, and fitness means not how fast you can run, but fertility. That's what fitness means in terms of a biological sense. And it means survivability of her calves, resilience of her and her calves, and those things seem to go. Now think about climate change. We're not going to get into a discussion about why, but we're going to get a discussion about if the climate is changing with more extreme weather, don't we need to have an animal that's more adaptable, right, to handle stuff? Because we're not going to go out and shelter it from severe winters and lots of snow. We need something that's going to survive. Okay, so when we look at this animal, we know its breed composition right now. What would be the thing we would do to maintain that hybrid vigor? What would we do? And you've got to keep in mind the breeding goal that's just been set, right? Calf every year, good weaning weight, big calf birth weight, or a moderate calf birth weight. But think about it. What would we do? What breed would we bring in? Would I bring in a Charolais here? I'm going to bring in a Charolais. So you're going to have to tell me what's wrong with that. What's wrong? Come on.
There's only 6% on their Charolais isn't with the hybrid score that high. You might want to bring in something with Angus and Simmental, because that's what she seems made up for.
Okay, so there's a comment. So the result of that, so you're looking at type. You're saying, look, this is the kind of female that I think fits in my environment. Because you know something? The reason that you have these breeds is because of your environment and management. You've already chosen the type of animal that fits. So for sure, we don't want to deviate very far in terms of biological type, right? Biological type is described in a couple ways. Body weight, okay? Charolais, bigger framed, later maturing, that means later fattening. Less milk, perhaps. So that's a biological type. Versus something that is a more moderate biological type, like a Red Angus, which is early fattening, early maturing, and lower in body weight, right? So what we've got to do is think about, I think if you bred this back to, let us say, an Angus, you would end up with, whether it's a red or black Angus, you'd end up with lower hybrid vigor score, which is not helping you in terms of fertility. okay? But it's keeping your type constant, like the type of biological type of animal. So that's one thought, okay? But why wouldn't you pick a Charolais?
How many cesareans do you want to do?
There you go. There's the answer. There's one of the answers. Like calf birth weight is going to be a problem. And if we are in a replacement heifer, right? If we're doing replacement heifers, that's the last thing we want, right? Particularly if we're extensive in our management, right? We got them out on the pasture, and I've got 600 head of cows and 100 replacements. I don't want that, right? But what would be another thing that we could do to maintain the biological type and maintain that level of hybrid vigor? Ah, there we go. An F1, but what would you be your F1? Or, another way is bring in, if you could find a good source, F1 females, right? Then you'd skip that first generation stuff, right? And you'd be bringing in maximum, almost maximum, but high amounts of hybrid vigor. So that's another one. So those are very good. That's why we're having this discussion, because you guys actually have better answers than I do. So there's one. Any other ideas here? Okay, so that's not bad. There's some thoughts there. There's a thought process that's going on. The part that I liked was the breeding objective. I found that to be a very solid one. Okay, so that's the female side. Let's flip this around, same cow, and let's move over to a terminal cross, okay? Everything that we have coming from this female and the bulls that we produce is going to go for feeder cattle. So in that case, what is our objective? What's our breeding goal? Weight. Yeah. Growth rate. Yeah. And why do you pick that? Right. Okay, partially. But when it comes down to value, what's giving you the most value? Weight. Right? So in slaughter cattle, regardless of what program we go into, whether it's AAA, whether it's Angus, certified Angus, Angus Pride, Sterling Silver, the number one factor affecting the amount of money you get back in your pocket is weight, is carcass weight. Okay, remember that. And some of us say it's 84% of the equation, so it's a big deal. It might be less in some cases, but if the premium gets really good for marbling and less for lean, then it gets to be pretty good. So growth rate is pretty important. Of course, the other part there is we got to have a calf on the ground, right? So we need to avoid calving difficulty. So calving ease becomes an extremely important thing here. If I go along here and I throw in a limousine or a Charolais, and I end up with a lot of calving difficulty, that's not helping anybody. So we have to be careful about it. But remember, define your breeding goal right off the bat. And remember here, maybe heterozygosity or hybrid vigor. Remember what I said about carcass traits and growth traits? It's maybe not that important, right? So maybe in this case, you can be a little bit more traditional about the breeding strategy and just go after EPDs, right? Genetic merit values for a bull that have growth rate, calving ease, those kinds of things, right? So therefore, it shows you that depends on your, the type of animal you've got or what you're breeding for, your breeding goals, and what markets you're going on, what you want to take advantage. When it comes down to female fertility, it appears that, as long as we've got the nutrition right and our body weight right, and they're gaining in terms of body condition score or energy status, the next most important thing there is how much hybrid vigor that female has. That's what's going to keep her, right? Okay, I think I'm done. Any other questions that you want to talk about? Can I let him go, Neil? What was this heifer bred to? What did we breed it to? We bred it back to a red Angus. Calving difficulty, calving ease. That's why. And so that's a really interesting question you ask, right? And so the main reason was calving ease. But it causes a lot of issues. Because then you know what we have is we have an animal, a female, next generation, if we pick the replacement heifer, that is even less hybrid vigor. And so what we do is we start this cycle of downward trend in hybrid vigor that we can't recover from, right? Because new animals coming into our herd are all going to have lower amounts of hybrid vigor than their mums, right? So, but that's what we did.
But she'd be in the herd longer if she can get bred again the second year.
If she's in the herd longer.
Yeah.
But you know something? Right now we know that heifer with low hybrid vigor is going to be lost in the next 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
She's gone, and I'm going to have to replace her.
Well, I'm curious about that, because of course with us, all our replacement heifers are bred, bred Angus for that reason, for that ease of calving. They get that first calf out with the problems. All those calves of ours, those first calf heifers, we never keep any of those as replacement heifers, they're all gone. So then for second year, that's when we introduce the new breed into her, because she's already produced a
Right.
good calf. And so I think you gotta look at the long term a little bit on that too, because that heifer is now going to start producing. For us, depending on what color or whatever we're into, she'll produce a nice Charlotte cross calf.
Yep.
And whatnot down the road. So now she'll have another. So now aren't we adding more of that back into that?
Yes, you are, but you still have the replacement heifer that you could be bringing back in, right? That you have that has lower retained heterozygosity or lower hybrid vigor from the first heifer, right? And I'm trying to get you around. There's a really good comment over here, an F1. If you could find somebody who you really trusted that could produce you F1s, that would be superior. That would be excellent. But I know exactly what you're doing, and that's one of the reasons I split it up into replacement heifers and then your cow herd, because once you get to your cow herd and you're dealing with, okay, it's going to a terminal market, like a feeder cattle market, well, geez, it opens it right up. As long as I have easy calving and some growth, I'm good to go, right? But remember, we've got to bring females back into our herd, and we want females from young cows because that's our young genetics. And often they don't have the most hybrid vigor in them, right? Yeah, so it's something that we have to think about, but I like the F1. It's a pretty quick solution, right? Yeah. Barry?
What happens if you introduce a Simmental to that cow, the offspring kept for replacement? How does that influence the size creep on that heifer? If this animal is 1,300 pounds, are you up to 1,350 with the next generation, 1,400 the next generation? How does that impact the animal?
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, if we did go to Simmental, by the way, the hybrid vigor score would be a bit better than if you did a red Angus cross, right? But in any way, you end up with frame creep. And even though we start with this cow, right? Seems like a pretty reasonably sized cow. Very quickly, as the years go by, because of growth and body fat and etc., our probably average cow is creeping up to 1,500 pounds. So you have to be careful. There's absolutely no doubt about it. We, in our environment, which tends to be, we have a lot of feed, we handle quite nicely 1,450, 1,500 pound cow. But we do not handle a Maine Anjou Charolais cross cow, which we had, which was running up to 1,700 pounds, and we were losing that cow very quickly, like at twice the rate because of open. The other thing I'd like to say is that we do a lot of swath grazing, winter grazing in Lacombe, and so when the cow reaches about 3.5 years of age, it goes on to winter grazing. And one of the things we'll notice is those cows that have lower hybrid vigor, once they go into a swath grazing situation where they're fighting for their food all winter. Even though it's in swaths, they still got to dig through it though, and sometimes it's 3 feet of snow and it's pretty cold out there. Those cows that have low hybrid vigor are usually the candidates that we lose for fertility.
Better to preference. You would increase your hybrid vigor score in the next generation?
Yep.
Your candidates?
I think it's okay, but remember, make sure that when you're picking the bull, you're picking a bull that's giving you, the EPDs for calving ease, and birth weight and growth rate that you need. Now, one of the difficulties here is that the EPD for Herefords are not in line. No, it's not the right way to say it. They're not calibrated to a crossbred. And so if you thought that when you calculated things out, you said, I think the calves that are going to be born from this cross in my young females are going to be about 80 pounds. I think they'll handle that. But there's 3% about hybrid vigor for birth weight. So they're actually 83 pounds. No big deal. But what if the winter and the nutrition changed? Because nutrition and weather can have an effect on birth weight, changed and you added another 6 pounds, and now your average birth weight was 80, right? So all of these things can have an impact on the actual result. That's one of the reasons why, going across breed in terms of EPDs are hard to predict sometimes. But I think that would be fine, right? So a Hereford is a more moderate-sized animal. Has different characteristics. It's going to be quite diverse, right? So your hybrid vigor score is going to jump maybe up to 75% or more in that particular case, right? Also remember, maximizing hybrid vigor is not the name of the game, right? You're trying to sort of optimize it around a certain time, right? Around 60% or 75%. But if you start pushing towards 99 or that's not good either, right? That's I think it's a little bit too much. It's too hard to do.
And is this, the percentage that you get there, is that just a simple calculation? Or is it?
No, that actually comes from a 50,000 SNPs. So we have a genomic panel that we determine what the genotype of an animal is, what its particular letters are, in terms of its genotype. And then what we do from that is we use it to put animals into different breeds. They cluster based on genetic distance. So Angus sort of cluster over on one side and Herefords cluster over on the other side. And that can be used to predict what an individual will be. There's another way of doing it. Just count up in your 50K panel, just count up the number of heterozygous alleles versus homozygous alleles. That's another way of doing it. But, there's different ways of doing it, right? And but that's how we do it. That's why we call it a genomic breed composition rather than pedigree. Pedigree is good on average. For an average herd, you come pretty close. But on an individual, you could be way off. You could say this is 40% something and it's actually 10% something because of recombination. Okay, so that's what happens.
So John, if I wanted to use this in my herd, what would I do? Who would I call? And what do I need?
You call the Ghostbuster over there. No, no. So I think one of the very basic things, the first thing, keep records. If you don't do anything, keep records because that's where you're going to find out. Next thing that isn't going to cost you anything is take a hair sample, take a DNA sample, keep it on file. So And Michelle, there are, as Michelle says, there's lots of videos to show you how to take a hair sample properly. As she says, don't send in a photocopy and don't cut the hair. Get some follicles from the tail switch. On young calves, you need a tissue sample from the ear because the hair doesn't work, right?
Yeah, so if the cow is so young that she doesn't have a tail switch yet, it won't work.
Yeah.
So you want either a blood draw or a tissue punch.
Yeah. So use a little Tipifex ear punch that puts a tag on the animal, and then the tissue, keep it. It's in a preservative, and it'll keep a long time. But on other animals, keep the hair. And then as you learn more about, genomic technology and its ability, and you understand what its return on investment is, then start a little bit small, right? Do sires, because that's going to be your most information you're going to get. You're going to get parentage right off the bat, so you're going to know what's going on there. And then a certain number of progeny, I would say female progeny, because they're also going to have an impact on your herd. And so to me, I would say strategically do things. If you want to jump in full blast, well, that's a different thing. Then the most important thing would be progeny, sire. And once you have that, the genomic breed composition on all your cows comes, like as an extra. Okay. Does that help?
Yeah, and I'm sending it to
You're sending it to Delta.
genomics.
You're sending it to Delta Genomics. Yeah. And if you want to know how, whether you ship it in a bus or an envelope or a whatever, talk to Michelle.
So what do I get back from you? What does Delta send me back? Do I get
Michelle, you want to take that?
So we sent back a results certificate. So it will have the animal's information, its ID. It's not what the company's doing. All right, so what you get back is a results certificate for each animal. So it'll have the animal's information. If we were able to verify it to a parent, it'll have the verified parent on there. There will be a chart on the bottom with the breed composition. It's just a colored graph, like the one in the brochures that are on the back table. And then it'll also have the vigor score on there. And if we're able to verify to the calf to its sire, we'll also have an estimated breed composition and vigor score for the dam without knowing who she is. It'll just say estimated dam. And then if you send us in a lot, we're also going to send you an Excel file with that information, so you don't have to go through hundreds of pages of results certificates, because that's annoying. And the very front page will be an average of all the animals that you sent in. So you'll have an average vigor score for the animals you sent in, and you'll have the average breed composition. So you can kind of see where your herd is at just in general.
I think there's one other thing that we could add to that, and it's what we do for our clients now that we work with cow-calf health management services. We provide a molecular breeding value on 10 traits. So 5 carcass traits I talked about: dry matter intake, average daily gain, body weight. That's 9. Anyway, I don't remember them all. But the carcass traits would be carcass weight, back fat thickness, marbling, ribeye area, lean meat yield. Okay, so those would be the carcass traits. So then there would be a molecular breeding value that would be sent back. And probably within a couple months, we'll be sending back what we call a value index. And it'll be a value index for certain sires within the population or the herd that says, this sire is more valuable in the carcass of its progeny, this by $100 or $200 or something, right? There'll be a value index. And that's something that we're working on right now, and it's probably a month or so away. So the tools that are going to be available are increasing quite a bit.
John, so is that the same price?
Yeah,
Same price?
yeah, it's the same cost.
$45?
Yeah, right, Michelle? But it's the same test, right? Because all it is it's a calculation, It's a calculation, right? And so the big thing is to do the original genotyping. And then with the genotyping, you've got all of the DNA information you need. And so then you can do parentage, composition, hybrid vigor, molecular breeding value. All of those are just computer calculations. They're not just computer calculations, but there's nothing extra that needs to go on there. So these things are going on. And so right now, to the clients we have within one of our large projects that's supported by Genome Alberta, that's what's going back to the client, which is molecular breeding value and the value index.